Hi, this is Eduardo Encina here with my buddy cop Rick Stroud. We're the Bucs beat writers for the Tampa Bay Times and TampaBay.com. And we are here a couple days before the NFL draft. And buddy cop, we're going to be talking about specifically about the Bucs and kind of the situations and the scenarios that could play out here in the first round. They're in an interesting spot here at 14 because as we've written a lot, they could trade up to try to get one of these offensive tackles. They could sit down at 14. Probably the least likely is that they trade down, but you never know what could happen as the draft progresses. So first off, let's just talk about what we think could happen if the Bucs stay at 14 as they are right now, and what's the most likely scenario. Obviously, that's middle ground. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, but what do you think could happen there at 14?
Well, I mean, if they stay where they're at, they have to hope a little bit that a bunch of quarterbacks go before them, pushes down at least one of those four. We've been talking about primarily four elite offensive tackles, right? I mean, if you're talking about Tristan Wirfs or Andrew Thomas or Mekhi Becton, who's the other guy I'm missing? Jedrick Wills. So one of those four guys they would probably be happy with, I would imagine. But having said that, they need a plug-and-play guy. So if they are unable to move up, and we can discuss those scenarios in a minute, I think that they'd be pleased to see one of those four tackles. Now, there is a situation where Josh Jones, in their minds, might be as good as the last guy, right, as the fourth guy that they're looking at. So in that case, could they get him later? Could they trade down? Did they take him there at 14? I don't think there's any question. They've advertised pretty much that right tackle is their biggest need spot. But having said that, I don't necessarily think that they're in a position where they have to force it either. Like, if you think there's a big gap between that last tackle that comes off the board and the next one, then maybe you trade down, or maybe you take a player, defensive tackle, whether that's, Javon Kinlaw or somebody like that, maybe even a wide receiver with Henry Ruggs or someone to fortify that speed receiver spot. So they're in a position where they're going to get a good player, maybe not a great player. And for that reason, I think, Eduardo, they're going to have to try to be a little aggressive. And the first attempt, I think, would be to move up, depending on what that team wants. But certainly you could see a situation where at 14, they still get a value pick.
Right. And obviously, when we're projecting what happens above them, I think there's two things to look at. One is where these quarterbacks are. Yeah. If three of those quarterbacks, we're talking Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, and Tua Tagovailoa, all go within the first six, which, how it's projected to go with the Bengals at 1, obviously, the Dolphins at 5, and the Chargers at 6. Then more than likely one of those tackles can slip down. The other aspect of it is the New York Giants at 4, because right now, if they go for an offensive lineman and trickle down, those four guys might not be there. Mm-hmm. And then, we're talking about, like you said, Josh Jones of Houston as the best available candidate. And so the question is, are they okay with being in that situation? I mean, the Giants right now, a lot of people saying back or safety from Clemson might be the best guy for them right there, but, they could use offensive line help too. So a lot of demand for that offensive line help early on in those first, 12 or so picks. Now, moving on to what might happen if they trade up. Now, we talked a lot about this too, but there's really one big spot that you kind of look at if they're going to move up, and that's number 9, mainly meaning that you would get ahead of the Jets and the Browns in the next two picks, Browns and the Jets in that order. And those are two teams that are obviously looking for offensive tackles. Now, it doesn't necessarily guarantee them, though, that they would have their choice of the 4, because the Cardinals are right above them at 8, and that would, they might take an offensive lineman there too. So, and the Giants are a wild card. I saw one mock draft that projected them to try to get up to 7, where the Panthers are. And that would be an interesting trade to make, with a division rival. But if they're at 7, they probably have the best pick of those guys, maybe. Obviously the Giants are the wild card there, but obviously, that puts them in a lot better spot to get whatever guy they want, and we don't know who that guy is that tops their board, right?
Right. Now, I think the question will be, the further you move, the bigger draft capital that you have to give up, right? And so, when you look at that, they're sitting here with a pick in each round and 2 picks in the fourth. I don't know that a fourth round pick is going to get you all the way from 14 to 9, okay? You may have to give up your third, but you have 2 fourths, so you could move back into the third round with that, depending on how far you're coming. So, I think the first thing you look at is next year, right? Are they all in for this season? Are they willing to give up next year's third rounder or second rounder, for example? I really think that second rounder this year is almost untouchable because you see a lot of good running backs kind of clustered early in the second round, and I think they're going to come off the board fairly quickly, and they want to make sure they get a 3-down back. So it's going to be tricky for them. And do they have enough capital to move up? How far do they need to move up? Can they let the draft come to them? And a lot of times it will, if you don't try to force things. I think there'll be a number of teams trading all over the place, trading up, trading down. And I definitely think that the teams behind them recognize the Bucs are going to go for an offensive lineman, and they may want to get in front of Tampa Bay, and that might run the price up on trying to get to number 9. So there's a lot of things that can happen. The Giants have been sort of targeted with defense as well. Guy like Derek Brown, might be somebody that they like. And if they don't go for an offensive lineman, that helps. But it's tough because they've more or less advertised the fact by not getting. I know they signed, the guy from Indianapolis is kind of a swing guy, but at the end of the day, they didn't re-sign DeMar Dotson. They have a hole there. Everybody knows it, and there's 4 tackles that most teams would be happy with. But that doesn't mean, for example, Eduardo, if you stayed at number 14 and those 4 tackles were gone and you didn't like what was there, the value, you thought, well, I can move down a few spots, right? Still get Josh Jones and another another second round pick, right? You might do that. You might say, hey, we don't think there's a big difference between the 4th tackle and Josh Jones, but we don't know what to take him at 14, so we'll move out, get some equity and use it, for more players, whether that's a receiver or running back. So there's a lot of things they can do, but it's really hard to predict right now. And then also, you've talked about O.J. Howard. How does he fit into this whole thing?
Right. And O.J. Howard, we do know that, obviously he was, there's a lot of trade talk about him out in back in October. The Bucs were trying to get a second-round pick for him, and they couldn't. So, it's been a long time since then. But if they're still trying to get a second-round pick for him, which would probably be what makes it worth dealing O.J. Howard, that's something that really
sure.
They're obviously it would be put a big difference into what their team looks like and what their draft class looks like too. I mean, moving on to just kind of the way, if they do trade down, and it's a situation too where, like you said, all 4 of these guys could conceivably be off the board at 14, and then there's a big gap there between, in terms of overall picks between, some of those, that last guy, whether it's, Andrew Thomas or whether it's Tristan Wirfs or, Becton, whoever it is, and Josh Jones. And Josh Jones has been a guy that people think could be in the lower first round or even the second round. So they could trade down and still, like you said, conceivably get him. Also, Jason Licht's made it clear that, and some of this might be, pre-draft posturing, but that, they're a team that's going to be, that's not necessarily, sometimes they might be in a situation where they're drafting the best player available over the position in need. And if they end up moving down and, some of these receivers like a Justin Jefferson or someone like that is down there, like you said, Javon Kinlaw, I don't think he slips that far down beyond them, but
right.
If he's still there on the board, some of these guys are real big buzz names too. So, you never know where they're going to go. A lot of people are talking about them now, but when it comes to draft day, who knows?
I think the key is, depending on how far you're moving, let's say you're going from 14, to 18. Okay. Are you okay? Do you have 5 players that you really like, right? And any of those 5 are there when you pick, because 4 of them are coming off the board, right? So you got to have 5 guys you'd be comfortable taking, say at 18 or 19 or wherever you go. And so that always becomes, sort of a chess match. I can remember, the one year, a couple of years ago, when they were just behind Denver and Indianapolis, right? And Bradley Chubb went to Denver right before them, and then right exactly before them, Indianapolis got Quentin Nelson. And those were the two, consensus really good players. They could have used either one of them. Well, they're sitting at 7, and they felt like, well, Vita Vea is a good player. We'd love to have him, but we don't need to take him at 7. They moved back, picked up some extra draft picks, and got him at 12. And so that's the sort of thing that, there were some players came off the board between 7 and 12, but they were happy with a number of guys, including Derwin James, who they didn't take, who went even later than Vita Vea. So that's sort of like, there's going to come a point in that draft where, 15 through 32, there's not a lot of difference. It's sort of beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's position specific, but really all those players are going to be rated very similar. So I think, if you don't get your guy at 14, then absolutely you look to move out of there, and you hope that maybe there's another quarterback that's still on the board. Maybe there's somebody will come up and get for you, and you don't have to move down that far. But it's, Jason Light has definitely moved down. We haven't seen him move up much, and I think that's because you got to give up a lot of draft capital. But again, to me, this is a different year. This is Tom Brady. This is all in right now. You've got maybe 2 seasons. Hopefully you play this year, 3 at the most. But I think the guys you get in this draft, at least in the early part of the draft, have to come in and contribute right away, no matter what position they're playing.
Obviously, yeah, that's a situation. It's almost a new era of the Bucs.
Yeah.
Light has placed so much value on picks, so much value on the development of guys, and right now it's about helping the team win now, because this is the Tom Brady era. All right, well, as we break down this round, there'll be a lot more draft coverage coming up this week leading up to the draft on TampaBay.com and in the Tampa Bay Times. Obviously, we will have coverage throughout the draft, first round on Thursday night, second and third on Friday, and then the rest of the draft on Saturday with myself, my buddy cop Rick Stroud, Matt Baker, John Romano, Joey Knight. We're going to have the whole group contributing. We'll have some videos, a lot of content for you. So follow along all weekend long here on TampaBay.com and in the Tampa Bay Times. For Rick Stroud, this is Eduardo Encina.